Grief is a strange country, one whose borders we only recognize when we are forced to cross them. But betrayal is the civil war that erupts within that country, burning everything we thought was home. Inside the grand, cold walls of Boston's Old North Church, the air was heavy with the scent of white lilies and unspoken sorrow. Sunlight struggled through the stained glass windows, casting muted colors on the city's most influential figures, all gathered to mourn the passing of Eleanor Vance, a titan of industry and a pillar of society. At the polished oak lectern stood her daughter, Amelia Vance Richards, a woman carved from the same stone of elegance and resolve. Dressed in impeccable black silk, she was the very picture of dignified grief, a successful lawyer delivering a flawless eulogy for the mother she believed she knew. Her voice, though thick with emotion, never broke as she spoke of Eleanor's strength, her charity, her unwavering moral compass. She painted a portrait of a matriarch who had built an empire and a perfect family, a monument of a woman. From the front pew, her husband, Mark, watched her with a look of profound adoration, a silent pillar of support in her darkest hour. Amelia paused, looking out at the somber faces, ready to deliver her final, heartfelt words. But the silence that followed was not hers to command. From the back of the church, a voice, clear and steady, sliced through the reverent hush. Eleanor Vance was my mother, too. Heads turned in a slow, disbelieving wave. A woman stood there, a stark contrast to the assembled mourners in her simple, worn coat. She was nobody and everybody, her face etched with a history Amelia couldn't read. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Amelia, burning with a lifetime of resentment and a terrifying certainty. Before anyone could dismiss her as a madwoman, she delivered the final blow, her voice ringing with conviction against the cold stone. "And unlike you," she said, her gaze locking with Amelia's, "I am her real daughter." The world froze, the air solidified. Every polite whisper, every stifled cough, died. Mark rushed to Amelia's side, his hand on her arm, but she didn't feel it. Her vision narrowed to the woman in the aisle, this ghost at the feast, the carefully constructed cathedral of her life, with its perfect mother and devoted husband, had just been leveled by a single sentence, and in its place was nothing but rubble and a chilling, unanswerable question. To understand the depth of the chasm that opened in that church, you must first understand the world that Amelia Vance Richards had so meticulously built, or rather, inherited and perfected. Her life was a study in controlled elegance, a symphony of quiet successes played out in a stately Beacon Hill brownstone overlooking the manicured greens of the Boston Public Garden. She was a partner at a prestigious law firm by 35, a testament to a mind as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. Her days were ordered, her closets were color-coded, and her emotions were filed away with the same ruthless efficiency as her legal briefs. She saw the world as a series of contracts, of agreements written and unwritten, and the cornerstone of her entire existence was the contract of her family, stable, powerful, and pristine. At the heart of this legacy was Eleanor Vance, a woman who cast a shadow as long and imposing as the skyscrapers she had helped finance. In Amelia's memory, her mother was less a maternal figure and more a formidable institution. Eleanor was a self-made queen who had clawed her way to the top of Boston's brutal real estate market with nothing but a fierce intellect and an unbendable will. Their relationship was one of professional admiration rather than tender affection. Love was expressed not through hugs or bedtime stories, but through shared expectations of excellence. Amelia remembered sitting at the vast mahogany dining table as a child, not coloring, but reviewing blueprints her mother had brought home, learning the language of leverage and assets before she had even learned algebra. Eleanor taught her daughter that vulnerability was a liability and that the Vance name was a shield, a brand, something to be polished and protected at all costs. There were no messy emotions, no raised voices, only the quiet, relentless pursuit of more. Amelia loved her mother, but she loved the idea of her more, the icon, the legend. The actual woman, with her guarded eyes and unspoken history, remained a beautiful, impenetrable fortress. And into this world of cool, structured ambition walked Mark Richards, a man who seemed to be made entirely of warmth and sunlight. He was a successful architect, his charm as natural and effortless as his designs. Where Amelia was all sharp angles and logic, Mark was gentle curves and intuition. He was the one who would pull her away from her work, his hands warm on her shoulders, reminding her that there was a world beyond depositions and boardrooms. He filled their quiet home with laughter, with the scent of good food, with a sense of ease that Amelia had never known. He admired Eleanor's strength but wasn't intimidated by it, and he cherished Amelia not for her accomplishments, but for the quiet, hidden parts of her she rarely showed to the world. He was her safe harbor, the one person with whom the contract of life felt simple, unconditional. He was the emotional core she outsourced, allowing her to focus on the relentless climb. Their marriage was the envy of their social circle, a perfect partnership of power and grace. He was her anchor, her confidant, the man who held the key to the carefully guarded chambers of her heart. Amelia believed, with the certainty of a proven fact, that their love was the one unassailable truth in her life. Far from the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, in the gritty, working-class neighborhoods of South Boston, another life had run a parallel, unseen course. Clara Jenkins grew up in a world defined by what it lacked. Her home was a cramped apartment that always smelled of damp and her neighbors' cooking. Her view was not of a pristine garden, but of brick walls and fire escapes. Yet Clara was forged in that fire. She was whip-smart, with an observational intelligence that missed nothing. She learned to read people the way Amelia learned to read contracts, spotting weaknesses and hidden desires with a predatory instinct. While Amelia was vacationing in the Swiss Alps, Clara was working 2 jobs to put herself through community college. While Amelia was being celebrated in society pages for her charity work, Clara was reading those same pages with a cold, simmering rage. Her mother, a worn-out waitress with a string of bad boyfriends, had given her a tattered birth certificate on her 18th birthday, along with a story whispered in shame, a story of a wealthy, powerful woman who had given her away to escape a scandal. Clara didn't just grow up with a chip on her shoulder. She grew up with a gaping hole where her identity should have been. She watched the Vance family from afar, a digital ghost haunting their online presence. She saw the photos of Amelia, the perfect daughter, living the life that should have been hers. It wasn't just the money she craved, though the thought of it was a constant, gnawing hunger. It was the name, the legitimacy, the simple, brutal justice of taking back a life she believed had been stolen. Her resentment was not a fiery explosion, but a slow-growing, meticulously tended garden of poison, cultivated over years of perceived injustice. She had educated herself, learned about the Vance Empire, and waited, with the patience of a predator, for the perfect moment to strike, the moment when her target would be at its most vulnerable. So when Clara Jenkins stood in that hallowed church, she was not some random malcontent. She was the culmination of a lifetime of silence, the living embodiment of a secret Eleanor Vance had thought she had buried forever. And Amelia, standing frozen at the altar, was finally forced to see that her entire life, her relationship with her formidable mother, her trust in her perfect husband, and her own identity as the sole heir to a dynasty was not a fortress built on stone, but a fragile house of cards, and a stranger's breath was all it took to bring it all crashing down. The aftermath of the funeral was a chaotic, unraveling tapestry of hushed speculation and frantic whispers. In the solemn quiet of the church vestry, a room that smelled of old wood and candle wax, the Vance family's carefully maintained facade crumbled under the weight of Clara's declaration. Amelia, vibrating with a cold, precise rage, stood opposite the woman who claimed to be her sister. This was no longer a matter of grief. It had become a hostile takeover of her reality. Mark was a constant, soothing presence at her side, his hand a steady pressure on the small of her back, murmuring calming words that she didn't hear. Her focus was entirely on Clara, who met her furious gaze not with fear, but with an unnerving, almost serene composure. She was not behaving like a fraud caught in a lie. She was behaving like someone who had come to collect a long overdue debt. "This is absurd," Amelia finally bit out, her voice dangerously low. "You are a con artist, and I will have you removed for trespassing and harassment." Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her simple cloth handbag and retrieved a worn, creased document its edges softened by time. She unfolded it and placed it on the antique table between them. It was a birth certificate issued 38 years ago. The mother's name was listed in faded ink as Eleanor Vance. "I don't want a scene," Clara said, her voice even. "I just want what's mine. Let's do a DNA test, a legally binding one. When it proves who I am, we can talk about the rest." For Amelia, a lawyer to her very core, this was a challenge she couldn't refuse. The proposition of a DNA test was like a familiar weapon placed in her hand. It was evidence. It was fact. It was the tool she would use to surgically remove this cancer from her life and restore order. "Fine," she snapped, a sharp, brittle sound. "You'll have your test. And when it exposes you, my lawyers will ensure you spend the rest of your life regretting this." The days that followed were a strange, suspended limbo. The grand house in Beacon Hill felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Haunted by the ghost of a mother, Amelia was realizing she never knew. She moved through the rooms in a haze of anger and anxiety, waiting for the lab results that would either validate her entire existence or shatter it completely. During this time, Mark was a masterpiece of supportive husbandry. He canceled his meetings, screened her calls, and filled the oppressive silence with a steady stream of reassurances. He would sit with her by the fire, holding her hand, his expression a perfect mask of concern. "Whatever happens, Ames," he'd say softly, "we're in this together, your mother." She was a complicated woman. She carried secrets. If this is true, it's not a reflection on you. It's a part of her past that we have to navigate. He was so reasonable, so compassionate, expertly framing the potential cataclysm as a mere family tragedy they could overcome. He was subtly planting the idea of acceptance, preparing her for a future that included Clara. And Amelia, desperate for an anchor in the storm, clung to his every word. Then the email arrived. The subject line was clinical, impersonal. DNA test results, Vance Estate. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she clicked it open. She scrolled past the technical jargon, her lawyer's eyes searching for the conclusion. And then she saw it. The words swam before her, stark and irrefutable. Maternal match probability, 99.999%. The screen blurred. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was true, all of it. Her mother, the icon of integrity, had a secret daughter. Amelia had a sister. A lifetime of carefully curated family history dissolved into a lie. The betrayal was so profound, it felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She was still staring at the screen, the cursor blinking over the impossible percentage, when the phone rang. It was Philip, the family's lawyer for over 40 years, a man who had bounced her on his knee as a child. His voice was heavy, strained. "Amelia," he said, foregoing any pleasantries, "I need you and Mark to come to my office. Now, there's something you need to see. It's about your mother's will." The lawyer's office, a place Amelia had always associated with security and tradition, now felt like a courtroom where she was the one on trial. The rich scent of leather and old paper did nothing to calm the cold dread coiling in her stomach. Philip sat behind his enormous desk, looking older than she had ever seen him. He couldn't meet her eyes. He cleared his throat and began to read from a document bound in blue. It was an addendum, a codicil to Eleanor Vance's last will and testament, dated, signed, and notarized just 3 weeks before her death. The legal language was dry, precise, and utterly devastating. Philip's voice seemed to come from a great distance as he read the final, world-altering clause. "And as such, I hereby decree that the remaining 50% of my entire estate, including all personal property, real estate holdings, and a 50% controlling interest in Vance Enterprises, I bequeath to my biological daughter, Clara Jenkins." Silence. A profound, echoing void filled the room. This was so much more than a secret sister. This was an abdication, an erasure. Her mother had not just acknowledged Clara, she had made her Amelia's equal. She had taken the kingdom Amelia was born to inherit and cleaved it in two, handing half to a complete stranger. The grief over her mother's death was instantly eclipsed by the searing, icy burn of this ultimate betrayal. As Amelia sat there, frozen in a state of shock too deep for tears, Mark sprang into his role. He wrapped a protective arm around her, his own voice a convincing performance of disbelief. He questioned Philip, his tone firm, asking about Eleanor's state of mind, about the possibility of undue influence. He was the perfect, enraged husband, defending his wife's honor. Then, he turned to Amelia, his face a portrait of loving concern. "It's a shock, my love," he whispered, his voice breaking just enough. "A terrible, terrible shock. But we'll fight this. And if we can't, she's your sister. It's only money. We have each other. That's all that matters. We will get through this. Together." He pulled her into his arms, and Amelia, her world reduced to ashes, let herself fall. She leaned on him, her one remaining pillar of strength, her sanctuary in the ruins, never once suspecting that the man holding her was the very architect of her destruction. The weeks following the reading of the will were a surreal purgatory. Mark, ever the diplomat, had persuaded a reluctant Amelia to let Clara move into the estate's guest house, a charming stone cottage nestled among the oak trees. He had framed it as a gesture of goodwill, a necessary step toward building a bridge, however fragile, and so Clara became a fixture in their lives, a constant, quiet reminder of Amelia's displacement. She would appear at the main house for tense, stilted dinners where Mark would single-handedly carry the conversation, asking Clara about her life with a journalist's manufactured curiosity while Amelia pushed food around her plate, the silence her only weapon. Clara played her part with unnerving skill. She was never overtly hostile or demanding. Instead, she projected a kind of humble gratitude that felt more insulting than open aggression. There was a smugness in her quiet deference, a glint of victory in her eyes when she thanked Mark for passing the salt, an unspoken assertion of her place at a table that had, until a month ago, been exclusively Amelia's. To the outside world, and even to Amelia in her most exhausted moments, it looked like a family trying to heal from a seismic shock. But in the dead of night, when the house was silent, and Mark was breathing softly beside her, Amelia's legal mind would begin its relentless cross-examination of the facts. Grief was a fog, but logic was a lighthouse, and it kept guiding her back to the same rocky, impassable shore. It made no sense. Her mother was not a woman ruled by sentiment. Eleanor Vance was a chess grandmaster in a world of checkers players. Every move she made was calculated, every decision weighed for its long-term impact. She had spent a lifetime building an empire, a legacy meant for Amelia. To believe that in her final, weakened days, she had impulsively decided to splinter that legacy out of a sudden pang of guilt for a child she had abandoned nearly 40 years ago. It was a narrative that simply did not compute. It was sloppy, and Eleanor Vance was never sloppy. One evening, as they were clearing the dinner plates, Amelia finally voiced the thought that had been circling her mind. "It's the timing that bothers me, Mark," she said, her tone measured. "Why 3 weeks before she died? Why not years ago? Why not set up a trust fund? Why change the entire structure of the company in a secret codicil? It's not how she operated." Mark stopped, his back to her at the sink. He sighed, a sound of practiced patience. "Ames, you're trying to find a business plan in a deathbed confession. She was dying. People get sentimental. They think about their regrets. Maybe she finally found the courage to right a wrong. Trying to analyze it like one of her mergers is only going to cause you more pain." His words were a soothing balm, but they felt like a dismissal. He was treating her like a hysterical widow, not like the sharp, analytical partner he had always claimed to admire. He told her to let it go, to focus on healing, to avoid antagonizing Clara with a witch hunt. His resistance was subtle, couched in the language of love and concern, but it was there. And for the first time, a tiny hairline crack appeared in the foundation of her trust in him. That was when Amelia decided to act alone. The next day, feigning a headache to avoid a planned lunch with Mark and Clara, she drove to the now empty family home where she had grown up, the house where her mother had spent her final days. The air inside was stale, everything covered in a thin layer of dust. She went straight to Eleanor's office, a sanctuary of leather and mahogany that still smelled faintly of her mother's jasmine perfume. This was where the real Eleanor had lived, among her files and her ledgers. And this was where Amelia would find the truth. She started with the medical files. For hours, she sat on the floor, poring over doctors' notes and prescription histories. Most of it was expected details of the aggressive cancer that had taken her mother's life. But then she found it. Tucked into a report from a geriatric specialist dated 2 months prior was a note: patient exhibiting periods of transient confusion and mild cognitive decline. Recommend monitoring. Amelia's blood ran cold. It wasn't dementia, not a full loss of capacity, but it was a weakness, a vulnerability, a window of opportunity for someone with ill intent. As she dug deeper, she found the invoices from a private nursing service she didn't recognize. A new nurse had been hired for the last 6 weeks of Eleanor's life, a woman named Isabella Rossi. Amelia had never met her, never even heard her name. Her mother's care had, for the last month, been in the hands of a complete stranger. Next, she turned to the financials, pulling box after box of bank statements. Eleanor's finances were, as expected, a model of clarity and order. Every transaction was documented, every investment tracked, until she reached the last 2 months. There, the pattern shattered. A series of large cash withdrawals began to appear, starting small and growing in frequency and amount. $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, all withdrawn from a personal account. Eleanor Vance did not use cash. She was a woman of platinum credit cards and instantaneous wire transfers. Cash was messy, untraceable. It was the currency of secrets and fear. Staring at the list of withdrawals, Amelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the unheated house. The confused patient, the mystery nurse, the missing cash, and the last-minute will. These were not the actions of a woman making peace with her past. This was the trail of a woman under siege. The fog of her grief was finally burning away, replaced by the cold, clear certainty that she was not just a disinherited daughter, she was the victim of a crime. She sat there for a long time, the damning papers spread around her on the expensive Persian rug. She was an excellent lawyer, but she knew her limits. She was too close, too compromised by her emotions. To uncover this, she needed a professional, someone who dwelled in the same gray, shadowy world where this conspiracy had been born. Back in her car, parked on a quiet side street blocks from her own home, she made the call. Her voice was steady, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside her. It was the voice she used in the courtroom, the voice of cold, hard fact. "It's Amelia Richards," she said into the phone. "I have a job for you. I need a comprehensive background check on a woman named Clara Jenkins. I want to know everything where she's lived, who she's known, where every dollar she's ever earned has come from." She paused, taking a breath. "And there's someone else. I need you to find the nurse who cared for my mother in her final weeks. Her name is Isabella Rossi. Find her. I want to know who hired her and who paid her." In that moment, the war ceased to be a passive tragedy she had to endure. It became a fight she was determined to win. Living a lie requires a level of mental fortitude Amelia never knew she possessed. Her life became a performance piece, a one-act play staged every evening in the elegant rooms of her own home. She was the grieving daughter, the reluctant sister-in-law, the wife leaning on her husband's unwavering strength. She smiled when Mark told a joke, passed the butter to Clara at the breakfast table, and discussed meaningless case files from work, all while a silent, frantic part of her mind was waiting for a single, encrypted email. The investigator she had hired, a man named Harris, was a ghost. He never called. His instructions had been clear. He would contact her when he had something concrete, and it would be through a channel that left no trace. Every ping of her phone sent a jolt of adrenaline and dread through her veins. During this agonizing wait, Mark was at his most attentive. He'd bring her a glass of wine in the evening, rubbing her shoulders and whispering how proud he was of her for handling an impossible situation with such grace. He spoke of the future, of how they, as a family, a new, strange family, would find a way forward. Every word of comfort was a turn of the knife. Every gentle touch felt like the caress of a spider. She would look into his handsome, earnest face, the face she had loved for a decade, and see only a mask, wondering what kind of monster lurked behind it. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The subject line was blank. The body contained only a single, secure link and a password. Amelia locked her office door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She typed in the password. A file opened, stark and clinical against her screen. It was Harris's preliminary report. She started with the call logs. Her breath hitched. A list of dates and times, a recurring number she didn't recognize paired with Mark's. Dozens of calls, hundreds of text messages. The log began not last month, but 3 months ago, long before Eleanor's final decline. The sheer volume was sickening, a secret, constant conversation happening in the margins of her own life. Next, she clicked on the financial summary. A series of small, wire transfers from a personal account Mark kept for discretionary spending to an anonymous online account. Harris, in his meticulous way, had traced that anonymous account. It belonged to Clara Jenkins. The amounts weren't large, a few $100s here, 1,000 there. It was just enough to be explained away as a gift, but the pattern was undeniable. It was the careful financing of an operation. But it was the final folder, labeled surveillance, that shattered the last vestiges of her denial. It contained a series of photographs taken with a long lens camera, dated 2 weeks before the funeral. The location was a dimly lit, nondescript hotel bar miles from the city center. In the first image, Mark and Clara were sitting across from each other in a booth, leaning in close, their expressions serious, conspiratorial. In the second, Clara was laughing, her head tilted back, and Mark was watching her with an expression Amelia knew all too well, a look of intimate, possessive admiration he had once reserved only for her. The final photograph was the one that broke her. Mark was standing, ready to leave. His hand was resting on the small of Clara's back, a gesture of casual, familiar ownership. It was the same way he touched Amelia 100 times a day. The image burned itself onto her brain. They weren't just allies, they were lovers. A great, silent scream built in her chest, but no sound came out. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, it transcended anger and landed in a cold, dead place of nothingness. Her husband had not just betrayed her with another woman. He had betrayed her with a woman who was part of a plot to systematically dismantle her life and steal her birthright. Every memory she had of the last year, every trip they'd taken, every shared meal, every night they had spent together, was retroactively poisoned. His concern during her mother's illness, his tears at the funeral, his comforting arms around her, it was all a lie. A monstrous, breathtakingly cruel performance, and she had been his fool. She sat there in the silence of her office for a full hour, a statue carved from ice. Then the ice cracked, and something new, something hard and diamond-sharp, formed in its place. Grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. Fury was her new fuel. She went home that evening, and the performance began. She greeted Mark with a kiss, her lips cold against his. At dinner, he spoke about a new project he was excited about, his eyes alight with passion. Amelia watched him, her mind a whirring supercomputer, analyzing his every micro-expression, cross-referencing every word with the cold, hard facts in the file she had memorized. He was talking about blueprints for a new building while she was seeing the blueprints of his treachery. When he reached across the table to cover her hand with his, a gesture of loving reassurance, it took every ounce of her self-control not to recoil. His touch felt like a brand, searing the truth of his deceit into her skin. Later that night, she lay in their bed, feigning sleep, as he read a book beside her. The intimacy of the space, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell she shared with her jailer. She listened to the sound of his breathing, the soft rustle of a turning page, and she planned. The report from Harris was a map of the past, but she needed to see the future. She needed to know what they were planning next. She needed to be inside their conspiracy. The opportunity came 2 nights later. Mark was in the shower, the sound of rushing water, a steady hum that masked the frantic beating of her own heart. His phone was on the nightstand, charging. Her hands, surprisingly steady, picked it up. She had already purchased the software, the most sophisticated spyware money could buy, used for corporate espionage and high-stakes divorces. She connected his phone to her laptop with a small cable. The installation window popped up, a progress bar moving with agonizing slowness. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The sound of the water was her countdown clock. She could hear him moving around, the shower about to end. The bar hit 100%, complete. She disconnected the cable, shoved the laptop under the bed, and placed the phone back on its charger, a fraction of a second before the bathroom door opened. Mark emerged, wrapped in a towel, steam curling around him, a relaxed smile on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her sitting up in bed. Amelia summoned a smile of her own, a perfect mirror of his affection. "Everything's perfect," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I was just waiting for you." He came and kissed her, oblivious. And in that moment, Amelia knew the balance of power had shifted. She was no longer the victim in their story. She was the hunter, and the trap was now set. The spyware on Mark's phone was a poisoned river flowing directly into Amelia's life. Every night, after he had kissed her goodnight and rolled over into a peaceful, traitor's sleep, she would slip out of bed and descend into the digital underworld of his betrayal. In the silent, blue-lit darkness of her study, she watched their secret world unfold in real time. She read the text messages, sickeningly sweet with pet names, and shared jokes at her expense. She saw the emails, coolly discussing the logistics of the Vance Enterprises takeover. She tracked their locations, seeing them meet for coffee at discreet cafes while Mark was supposedly at a construction site, or for late-night drinks when he was working late at the office. It was a constant, agonizing drip of venom. She learned the true scope of their ambition. They weren't satisfied with 50%. That was just the beachhead. Their plan, laid out in a series of self-congratulatory texts, was to dismantle her authority completely. "She's too emotional to lead," Mark had written to Clara one evening, just moments after he had been upstairs consoling Amelia over a manufactured business worry. "After the board meeting, we'll use her instability to argue for a new CEO. You, my love, will be the rightful head of your mother's company," Clara had replied. "And you'll be right beside me. We're so close. We just need to keep her comfortable and off balance." Comfortable and off balance. The phrase became a mantra of cold fury for Amelia. They were casting her as a fragile, hysterical woman, a prop in their grand drama. And the most painful part was, she had to play the role they had written for her. Living this duality was the most exhausting thing she had ever done. During the day, she was the grieving daughter, a little lost, a little overwhelmed. She would ask Mark for his opinion on company matters she had already decided, making him feel intelligent and in control. She would have stilted conversations with Clara, forcing a weak smile and agreeing that it's what mother would have wanted. Every interaction was a lie, a carefully calibrated performance designed to reinforce their belief that she was weakening, that their plan was proceeding flawlessly. There were moments she almost broke. One morning, Mark came up behind her while she was making coffee, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing her neck. "We'll get through this," he murmured into her ear. That morning, she had read a thread of his sexually explicit messages to Clara from the night before. A wave of pure physical revulsion washed over her, and for a terrifying second, she thought she was going to scream, to turn around and claw his eyes out. But she didn't. She leaned back into his embrace, her body rigid, and whispered, "I know we will. I couldn't do it without you." In that moment, the victim died, and a predator was born. It was no longer enough to expose them, to seek justice. Justice was a cold, impartial concept. What she wanted was retribution. She would not just defend her position, she would annihilate theirs. She would not just take back her company, she would leave them with nothing. Her grief had been a fog, but her rage was a crystal, and through it she saw her path with perfect, terrifying clarity. The plan began not with a bang, but with a whisper. She scheduled a discreet meeting with her personal financial advisor, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Beatrice who had managed Amelia's own earnings since she first made partner. In a quiet office overlooking the harbor, Amelia gave her instructions. She moved millions of dollars of her personal, non-inherited assets into a series of intricate, layered trusts, making them legally untouchable. She sold off stock portfolios Mark had advised her to buy, converting them into anonymous bearer bonds. She was building a war chest, a deep well of resources that her husband had no idea even existed. Her second front was legal. She began to live at her law firm, telling Mark she was burying herself in work to cope. In reality, she was using the firm's immense resources to build an ironclad case. The spyware, as Harris had warned her, would likely be inadmissible in court, the fruit of a poisonous tree. But it was the perfect map. It told her exactly where to dig. Guided by a string of damning emails, she subpoenaed the records of the private nursing service, finding the original hiring request and, more importantly, the payment records. The nurse, Isabella Rossi, had not been paid by the Vance estate, but by a shell corporation. A corporation that Harris, with a little illegal digging of his own, had traced back to a holding company owned by Mark Richards. It was the first piece of hard, admissible evidence, a direct financial link between her husband and the woman who had access to her dying mother. She spent her nights poring over the Vance Enterprises corporate bylaws, documents her own mother had written. She found it on page 82, a clause Eleanor had put in place to prevent hostile takeovers. It stated that any transfer of a controlling interest of more than 25% to a new party required a unanimous vote of approval from a specially convened ethics committee, a committee that Amelia, as current CEO, had the sole power to convene. Her mother, from beyond the grave, had handed her a shield. Now, all the pieces were in place. The money was secure. The legal strategy was forming. She had a shield, and she had a sword. All she needed was to choose the battlefield, and that required the final, most dangerous act of deception. One evening, she approached Mark, her eyes red-rimmed and convincing. She broke down, telling him he was right all along. She had been selfish and hostile. She was tired of fighting. She wanted to honor her mother's last wish and welcome Clara into the family, properly. "I want to host a dinner," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Here, with Philip, the lawyer. We can sign the final transfer papers, make it official, no more fighting. Let's just be a family." Mark's face lit up with a triumphant, patronizing sympathy. He pulled her into a hug, stroking her hair. "Oh, Ames," he said, his voice rich with feigned relief. "I knew you'd see it eventually. This is the right thing to do. This will make everything better." He thought he was witnessing her surrender. He had no idea he was accepting an invitation to his own execution. The silence before the storm had begun. In the quiet, charged days leading up to the dinner that would serve as her own personal Trojan horse, Amelia found herself inexplicably drawn back to her mother's empty home. Her plan was in motion, a complex machine of legal and financial traps, but a crucial piece of the engine was missing. She was fighting for an empire, for her own survival, but she felt a desperate, gnawing need to understand the woman at the center of it all. Not the corporate titan or the society matriarch, but the Eleanor Vance who had signed that catastrophic codicil. She needed to understand the why. She walked into her mother's private study, the room where she had first uncovered the financial and medical clues, but this time she wasn't looking for evidence. She was looking for a ghost. She ran her hands over the spines of her mother's leather-bound first editions, pulled open drawers filled with old fountain pens and monogrammed stationery. She found photographs of a younger Eleanor, her smile less guarded, standing beside a father Amelia had barely known. But none of it felt real. It was all part of the public record. Then, as she was examining the floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookcase, her fingers brushed against a section of ornate carving that felt different, slightly raised. She pushed. A section of the shelving clicked inward, revealing not books, but the cold, gray steel of a hidden safe. Amelia stared at it, her heart quickening. This was a part of the fortress she had never known existed. It was an old model, operated by a heavy, mechanical dial. There was no key, no digital pad, just the need for a combination her mother had taken to her grave. She tried the obvious numbers first: her own birthday, her father's, the date of her parents' anniversary. Nothing. She tried the address of the house, the founding date of the company. The lock remained stubbornly shut. Frustrated, she sank to the floor, trying to think not like a daughter, but like Eleanor. What dates truly mattered to a woman who had built her world from nothing? What was the foundational moment of her life? An idea sparked. She remembered a story her mother had told her only once about her very first real estate deal, a risky, leveraged purchase of a dilapidated warehouse on the waterfront that everyone said would bankrupt her. It was the deal that had launched everything. With trembling fingers, Amelia dialed in the date, the 14th of August 1975. A heavy, satisfying clunk echoed in the silent room. The safe was open. Inside, there was no jewelry, no bearer bonds, no deeds. There were only two objects: a thick, dark green leather journal and a small, silver USB flash drive. She sat on the floor and opened the journal. The handwriting on the first page was not the sharp, decisive script of the Eleanor she knew, but a younger, more rounded cursive. The story that unfolded in the faded ink was that of a stranger. A 20-year-old Eleanor, long before the power and the wealth, wrote of a passionate, secret love affair with a young artist, a man with a brilliant mind and no money, someone her powerful family would have ruthlessly cast aside. She wrote of their secret meetings, of a love that felt like the only real thing in her life. And then she wrote of the terror of a missed period, of a dawning, life-altering certainty. She was pregnant. The pages that followed were stained with what looked like tears. She detailed the impossible choice she faced: disgrace her family, lose her inheritance, and condemn both herself and her lover to a life of poverty, or give up the child. With heartbreaking clarity, Eleanor described the arrangements made in secret, the private adoption agency, the final, agonizing moment she held her newborn daughter before letting her go forever. The daughter's name was Clara. Amelia had to close the journal, a sob catching in her throat. This was the source of it all, the deep, unhealed wound that her mother had carried in silence for 40 years. It wasn't a casual secret. It was the defining tragedy of her life. As she read on, skipping through the years, she found more recent entries. Eleanor, now wealthy and powerful, had hired an investigator to find her lost daughter. She had found Clara, learned of her difficult upbringing, and her heart had broken all over again. Overcome with guilt, she had established a substantial, anonymous trust fund that had paid for Clara's college education and provided a modest but steady income, a stream of quiet support from a ghost she never knew she had. Her mother had been trying to atone, in the only way she knew how, with money. After taking a few moments to compose herself, Amelia picked up the USB drive. It felt cold and heavy in her hand. She plugged it into her laptop, and a single folder appeared on the screen, containing a dozen audio files, labeled simply by date. She clicked the first one. Her mother's voice filled the room, but it was a voice she had never heard before. It was thin, breathless, and laced with a fear that made the hairs on Amelia's arms stand up. "It's October 12th, the recording began, a slight tremor in Eleanor's words. "Mark brought another man to see me today. He said he was an estate planner, that we needed to simplify things. I was tired. I signed what he put in front of me." Amelia listened, frozen, as the recordings painted a chilling picture of her mother's final weeks. Eleanor spoke of her growing confusion, of Mark's constant, cloying presence. He was always there, bringing her documents, managing her nurses, isolating her from old friends. Then, he had brought Clara. "He told me he found her," Eleanor whispered in one recording, her voice cracking. "A miracle. My daughter. She has his eyes, not the artist's. Mark's eyes, hungry. She is so kind to me. She holds my hand. But when she looks at me, she is assessing my value." The final recording was the most chilling. I think I've made a terrible mistake," Eleanor rasped, her breathing shallow. They worked together. I see the way he looks at her. This wasn't about making amends. This was an invasion. "Amelia, If you find this, you are smarter than me. You are stronger. Do not let them take what we built." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Amelia sat in the dark, the journal in her lap, and the laptop glowing in front of her. She finally understood. Her mother had not been a fool, nor had she been a sentimental woman overcome by guilt. She had been a victim, trapped in a failing body and a brilliant mind clouded by medication and fear. Mark had not just preyed on Amelia. He had preyed on her dying mother, using the deepest wound of her life as the very weapon to destroy her. A profound, aching sadness washed over Amelia, followed by a wave of incandescent rage. This was no longer just about her inheritance or her husband's infidelity. This was for her mother. She would not be remembered as the weak, confused woman on those recordings. Amelia would restore her legacy. She would become the storm Eleanor had taught her to be. And she would use her mother's last, desperate message as the thunder that would bring the entire rotten structure crashing down. The echo of her mother's last, rasping words from the audio file lingered in the study like a sacred vow. Amelia sat there, surrounded by the three crucial artifacts of her new reality: the damning report from her investigator, her mother's heartbreaking journal, and the will that had started it all. For weeks, she had viewed that will as a document of betrayal, the final, inexplicable act of a mother who had either lost her mind or her love for her only daughter. But now, with the chilling context of the secret recordings, the words on the page began to warp and realign, shifting from a verdict into a riddle. Her lawyer's mind, trained to see patterns and strategies where others saw only chaos, began to work feverishly. The central question was a paradox. If Eleanor knew she was being manipulated, if she suspected Mark and Clara's motives, why on earth would she hand them the keys to the kingdom? Why would a woman who had fought and clawed for every inch of her empire simply give half of it away? It felt like a contradiction, a fatal flaw in the logic of the woman she was just beginning to understand. Amelia closed her eyes, trying to reconstruct her mother's final days not as a daughter, but as a strategist assessing a hostile situation. She pictured Eleanor, physically weak but mentally alert, trapped in her own home. Her movements were restricted. Her primary caregiver, the nurse Isabella, was a hireling of the enemy. Her son-in-law, a man she was beginning to distrust, controlled access to her, managed her affairs, and likely monitored her communications. Her mother had been a queen under siege in her own castle. In that state, what would a direct act of defiance have accomplished? A frantic phone call to Amelia? Mark would have intercepted it, explained it away as a symptom of her confusion. An attempt to flee? To reach her lawyer? Impossible. They could have used any such act as proof of her incompetence, grounds to seize legal control of her affairs and have her declared mentally unfit. She had been, in the most practical sense, a hostage. And what does a smart hostage do? They don't rattle the bars of their cage. They study their captors, they play along, and they look for a single, hidden opportunity to pass a message to the outside world. The will. Amelia's eyes flew open. The will wasn't the surrender. It was the message in a bottle. A jolt went through her, a shocking, electrifying moment of clarity. Her mother hadn't been defeated. She had been plotting. It was a desperate, breathtakingly brilliant gambit. By signing the codicil, by giving Mark and Clara the very thing they craved, Eleanor had accomplished two critical objectives. First, she had appeased them. She had lulled them into a state of supreme, arrogant confidence. Their guard would be down, their mission seemingly accomplished. This act of surrender would have guaranteed her a measure of peace and safety in her final, agonizing days. Second, and far more importantly, she had created an inherently unstable and suspicious situation that she knew, with absolute certainty, Amelia would never accept. Eleanor knew her daughter. She knew Amelia's pride, her intelligence, her bulldog tenacity as a lawyer. To be so publicly and bizarrely disinherited would be a red flag Amelia could not possibly ignore. The will wasn't meant to be honored. It was meant to be the catalyst for the very investigation Amelia had launched. It was the first domino, designed to set off a chain reaction that would lead her daughter to the truth. A short, sharp laugh of pure, astonished admiration escaped Amelia's lips. "You, magnificent woman," she whispered to the empty room. It was the final move of a chess grandmaster, sacrificing her queen in a way that guaranteed a checkmate 3 moves later. And then the final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, so perfect, so elegant, that it took her breath away. The corporate bylaw. The poison pill clause on page 82 that her mother had written a decade ago. The rule that a transfer of more than 25% of the company required a unanimous vote from an ethics committee that only the CEO, Amelia, could convene. Eleanor hadn't just hoped Amelia would fight. She had laid a perfect, legally binding trap deep within the company's foundational documents. The will was the bait. The bylaw was the steel-jawed, inescapable teeth of the trap itself. By bequeathing a 50% controlling interest to Clara, Eleanor had knowingly and deliberately triggered her own poison pill. She was setting up a legal impossibility, a checkmate that could only be executed by the very daughter the will seemed to betray. In that moment, Amelia's entire perception of her mother was rewritten. The emotional distance, the relentless focus on strength and strategy, the cool detachment, it hadn't been a lack of love. It had been training. Eleanor hadn't been raising a daughter. She had been forging a weapon, an heir capable of not just running an empire, but of defending it from the jackals at the gates. The will was her mother's final exam, a brutal, high-stakes test of everything she had ever taught her. A profound, overwhelming wave of love and respect washed over Amelia, so powerful it felt like grief. She finally understood her mother, not in the simple way a child understands a parent, but in the way a soldier understands a brilliant general. Her mother hadn't abandoned her in the end. She had armed her, trusted her, and planned her counterattack from beyond the grave. Amelia's resolve, already hardened by rage, was now tempered by a deep sense of honor and filial duty. The dinner she had planned was no longer just her stage for revenge. It was the final act of a play written by Eleanor Vance. The players were all in position, just as her mother had foreseen. And Amelia was not merely an avenging daughter. She was the executor of her mother's will, her true will. She would not just be taking back what was hers, she would be completing the final, masterful move of the queen. With the chilling clarity of her mother's final gambit settling in her soul, Amelia began to orchestrate the final act. She moved with the unnerving calm of a chess master who sees the board 5 moves ahead. The first step was to set the date. She approached Mark one evening, her performance of a weary, resigned woman, now honed to perfection. "I've asked Philip to join us for dinner next Friday," she announced, her voice soft and slightly melancholic. "I think it's time. We'll sign the final transfer documents. We'll do it here, in the dining room. It seems appropriate." Mark's face flooded with relief and a poorly concealed triumph. He pulled her into a hug, stroking her hair. "That's my girl," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "I knew you'd do the right thing. It's what your mother would have wanted." Amelia saw him exchange a swift, gloating look with Clara over her shoulder, a silent confirmation of their victory. She simply closed her eyes and leaned into his embrace, a silent promise of the ruin to come. The week that followed was a masterclass in deception. Outwardly, the Vance estate was a picture of healing. Mark was effusive, constantly talking about the bright new future of the company. Clara, emboldened, began to shed her meek facade, offering unsolicited opinions on the household decor and openly discussing business strategies with Mark in Amelia's presence, as if she were already a ghost. They were blinded by their success, their arrogance, a fog so thick they couldn't see the abyss opening at their feet. But while her public self was a study in placid acceptance, her private self was a general preparing for war. Her study became her command center. Each night, she meticulously assembled the instruments of their destruction. For Philip, she prepared a legal dossier bound in fine leather, a presentation worthy of a Supreme Court argument. It contained the meticulously documented financial trail connecting Mark to the shell corporation that had paid the nurse, Isabella Rossi. It contained the highlighted corporate bylaw, Eleanor's poison pill, alongside a draft of a motion to block the transfer of shares. It concluded with a formal petition citing conspiracy, fraud, and undue influence to have the codicil declared void. This was the logical, legal weapon. For the dinner itself, she prepared a more visceral one. On a slim, powerful tablet, she created a timeline of their deceit. She loaded the surveillance photos Harris had taken, blowing them up in high resolution. She transcribed the most damning text messages, the ones where they mocked her fragility and planned her ousting, overlaying them on the images. And she embedded the audio files from her mother's USB drive, each one cued to the most damning statement, her mother's weak, fearful voice, ready to speak from the grave at the tap of a screen. She left nothing to chance. She made 2 final, untraceable calls. The first was to Harris. "I need you and an associate nearby on Friday night," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "Don't be seen. Just be ready." The second call was to a senior detective in the Boston Police Department, a man whose career she had inadvertently saved years ago with a brilliant piece of pro bono legal work. "David," she said, "I'm not calling as a lawyer tonight. I'm calling as a friend. I am about to privately expose a multi-million-dollar fraud. It will be a family matter, and it will get ugly. I don't want a scene, but I may need a quiet, professional presence to keep the peace and take a statement afterward. Can I count on you?" The detective, remembering his debt, agreed without hesitation. On the evening of the dinner, Amelia moved through the grand Vance dining room, a director setting her final scene. The long mahogany table, a symbol of the Vance legacy, was set with the family's finest silver and china. The crystal glasses gleamed under the soft, dramatic light of the chandelier. On the wall, the oil-painted portraits of her ancestors, stern and unyielding, seemed to serve as a silent jury. Before the others arrived, she did a final check. A tiny, high-fidelity microphone was taped beneath the table in front of Mark's and Clara's designated seats. A lawyer's instinct, a predator's foresight. She would have a record of every lie, every confession. The guests arrived precisely at 8. Mark was radiant, playing the part of the gracious host, a man bringing his fractured family together. Clara was almost unrecognizable from the woman at the funeral. She wore a designer dress that was too loud for the occasion, her eyes sweeping across the room with the undisguised hunger of a new monarch surveying her territory. And then came Philip, his face a roadmap of concern. He clasped Amelia's hand, his eyes searching hers for answers she could not yet give. The dinner began. The first course was served, the conversation as brittle as the toast points. Mark prattled on about his vision for the company. Clara chimed in with saccharine pronouncements about continuing Eleanor's philanthropic work. It was a grotesque parody of a family dinner. Amelia played her part, a ghost at her own feast. She ate little, spoke less, and watched them. She watched them drink her mother's expensive wine and discuss how they would spend her mother's money. She let them perform their victory lap, let them bask in the warmth of their success, all while the hidden recorder captured every arrogant, self-incriminating word. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled snake in the center of the table. Mark and Clara felt it as excitement, the thrill of the finish line. Philip felt it as dread. Amelia felt it as the sweet, sharp calm of imminent, righteous violence. As the plates from the main course were cleared away, a hush fell over the table. The performance was over. Mark, smiling benevolently, reached for the folder of legal documents Philip had brought. "Well," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "shall we make it official?" Amelia looked from Mark's triumphant face to Clara's greedy eyes. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water, placing the glass down with a soft click that seemed to echo in the room. She placed her linen napkin neatly on the table, a gesture of finality. The mask of the grieving daughter dissolved, replaced by the cold, impassive face of a judge about to deliver a sentence. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice perfectly level, utterly devoid of the fragility she had feigned for weeks. "Before anyone signs anything, there is the small matter of the truth we need to discuss." The silence that followed Amelia's statement was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the last embers of false congeniality. Mark was the first to break it, a short, condescending laugh. "Amelia, darling, let's not be dramatic," he said, his voice dripping with the same patronizing concern he had used for weeks. "You're emotional. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Let's just sign the papers and..." I'm not speaking to you, Mark, Amelia cut in, her voice slicing through his sentence. She did not even look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the family lawyer. Philip, she said, her tone formal and clear. As the executor of my mother's estate, you have a fiduciary duty to ensure the legality of her final wishes. Before you officiate this transfer, you must be made aware of information that suggests this codicil was executed under conditions of conspiracy, fraud, and undue influence. With a slow, deliberate movement, she pushed the leather-bound dossier across the polished table. It slid to a stop directly in front of the lawyer. Philip hesitated, looking from Amelia's cold, hard face to Mark's growing agitation, then opened the folder. His eyes, accustomed to scanning dense legal text, moved quickly. They widened, then widened again. A deep flush rose from his collar. Mark was on his feet now, his mask of charm cracking. What is this? Amelia, this is insane. You're still grieving. You're not thinking clearly. Clara, quick to follow his lead, put a hand to her chest, her face a picture of wounded innocence. Amelia, please, she pleaded. After all our talks, I thought we were finally going to be a family. Amelia finally turned her head, her eyes locking on Clara's. The time for talks is over, she said softly. Then her gaze shifted to her husband. You're right, Mark. I wasn't thinking clearly, but I am now. She picked up the tablet from the table beside her, its screen dark. You've both been so concerned about my emotional state. Let me show you what has made me so clear. She tapped the screen. It lit up, illuminating the dim room, and on it was a high-resolution photograph of Mark and Clara in the hotel bar, their heads close together in intimate conversation, his hand resting possessively on her back. A collective gasp came from Philip. Clara's face went white as a sheet. That's a business meeting, Mark stammered, his voice suddenly an octave higher. Clara was going through a difficult time. I was offering her support, as a brother-in-law. Was this also brotherly support? Amelia said, her voice dangerously quiet. She swiped the screen. A text message appeared, superimposed over the photo. It was from Mark to Clara. Just keep her calm. She's so fragile right now, she's buying all of it. She swiped again. Another message, this one from Clara. I almost feel bad for her. Almost. Can't wait until we can run this company properly. Swipe. A photo of them kissing, taken from a distance, grainy but undeniable. Swipe. An email thread discussing how to leverage Amelia's instability with the board of directors. With each swipe, another layer of their deceit was peeled back, laid bare on the table for all to see. Their stammered denials grew weaker, dissolving into choked silence. They were cornered, exposed, crucified by the light of a 10-inch screen. You built this entire grotesque fantasy on the belief that my mother was a weak and sentimental woman in her final days, Amelia continued, her voice resonating with a cold power. You forgot who she was. You forgot that she was a fighter. But she didn't forget, and she wanted to make sure you remembered. She pressed a final icon on the screen, an audio file, a play button, and then her mother's voice, weak, papery, but unmistakable, filled the dining room. He brings me papers to sign. I was tired. I signed what he put in front of me. Clara is so attentive, but her eyes are hungry. I think I've made a terrible mistake. Mark collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had been cut out from under him. Clara let out a strangled sob, her hands flying to her mouth. The voice from the grave, the ghost they thought they had silenced, had returned to pass judgment. The recording ended, plunging the room back into a thick, suffocating silence. Amelia stood up slowly, the queen of this ruined banquet. The will, she announced, her voice ringing with finality. The document you conspired to create with a dying woman is worthless. She looked to Philip, who was staring at a page in the dossier, his face a mixture of horror and dawning, professional admiration. As Philip can now confirm, my mother, in her infinite strategic wisdom, created a trap for you. By bequeathing a 50% interest to an outside party, you triggered Clause 14B of the Vance Enterprises corporate charter, a poison pill clause. She let the words hang in the air. It requires a unanimous vote of approval from a specially convened ethics committee, a committee that I, as CEO, have the sole power to convene. The meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. Your transfer of shares will be the only item on the agenda. It will be a short meeting. The hope of money, the entire foundation of their plot, vanished in an instant. But Amelia wasn't finished. She turned her gaze to her husband, a man who now looked like a stranger, a hollowed-out shell of the person she thought she knew. All these weeks, you were so concerned about my mental health, my emotional state. You were right to be, because my grief has made me incredibly thorough. Her final, devastating gaze fell upon Clara. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, "you came here demanding a family. You wanted the Vance name. Well, congratulations. You're going to have it. Your name, Clara Jenkins, will be linked with my family's forever in the court records for the fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse charges. I will be filing with the district attorney's office tomorrow morning." The heir left the room. It was no longer about money or control. She was taking their freedom. The trap was not just legal or financial, it was total. They stared at her, their faces masks of pure horror, finally understanding the full, terrifying scope of her retribution. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her grief for fragility. They had never realized they weren't dealing with a grieving daughter. They were dealing with Eleanor Vance's chosen successor, and the trial was already over. The finality of Amelia's words sucked the very air from the room. For a long moment, no one moved. Mark and Clara were statues of shock, their faces pale and slack-jawed, the architects of a grand empire now standing in its ruins. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second a hammer blow marking the end of their lives as they knew them. Philip was the first to stir. He closed the leather dossier with a soft, definitive snap. He looked at Mark, a man he had known for a decade, and then at Clara, a stranger who had brought this plague upon the house. His face, usually a mask of professional neutrality, was etched with a cold, undisguised contempt. "Mark, Clara," he said, his voice the formal, chilling tone of a judge delivering a verdict. "Based on the evidence I have seen here tonight, which appears to be extensive and compelling, I am advising you both to secure immediate and separate legal counsel. As of this moment, my firm can no longer represent any of your interests in any capacity. You are on your own." It was a formal excommunication, a legal and social severing. Just as he finished speaking, the clear, sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. Mark and Clara flinched as if a gunshot had been fired. Amelia, however, was perfectly still. "Excuse me," she said calmly, and walked out of the dining room. They heard the heavy front door open, the murmur of a low voice. She returned moments later, followed by two men in plain, dark suits. They were quiet, their expressions impassive, but their presence instantly changed the atmosphere of the room, transforming it from the site of a family drama into a crime scene. Detective David Chen, the man Amelia had called, nodded once to her before turning his professional, assessing gaze upon the scene. His eyes took in the lavish table, the terrified faces of Mark and Clara, and the grim expression of the family lawyer. The sight of official authority shattered the last of Mark's composure. He lunged to his feet, a pathetic imitation of his former confidence. "Detective, there has been a terrible misunderstanding," he began, his voice cracking. "This is a private family matter. My wife, she's been under a great deal of stress since her mother's death. She's not in herself." The detective's gaze remained flat, unmoved by the blustering of a wealthy man accustomed to being obeyed. He simply looked at Philip. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice neutral, "does this situation require our intervention?" Philip adjusted his glasses. "Detective," he replied, his words precise, "I have been presented with evidence suggesting a coordinated effort to defraud the Vance estate, including the coercion of a terminally ill woman. I believe a formal investigation is, without question, warranted. That single, professional confirmation was the final nail." Clara let out a wrenching sob, all pretense of strength gone. She crumpled in her chair, the expensive dress looking like a costume on a broken doll. "It was him," she wept, pointing a trembling finger at Mark. It was all his idea. He found me. He told me what to do. He said it was my birthright. I just wanted to know my mother. I didn't. I never wanted to. Her confession dissolved into a chaotic, hysterical mess of pleas and accusations, a final, desperate act of self-preservation. Detective Chen ignored her outburst. He addressed both Mark and Clara, his tone polite but unbreakable. "Mr. Richards, Miss Jenkins, we'd like you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. We can continue this conversation there." There were no handcuffs, no raised voices. It was a quiet, civilized dismantling. They were escorted out of the dining room, past the portraits of the Vance ancestors who had witnessed their humiliation. As Mark passed Amelia, he shot her a look of pure, venomous hatred, the look of a defeated king. Amelia met his gaze without flinching, her expression as blank and hard as marble. Then they were gone, the front door closing behind them with a soft, heavy thud. The house fell into a profound silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Amelia stood alone in the grand dining room, the table still a tableau of the aborted feast. The half-empty wine glasses, the beautifully arranged food growing cold on the plates, it all looked like a grotesque parody of celebration. Philip walked over to her, his expression weary. "Your mother," he said, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. "She was the most brilliant strategist I ever met. To have planned for this, to have laid such a perfect trap, it's astonishing." He placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Amelia, you have the full, unconditional support of my firm. We will pursue this with every resource we have. We will ensure they are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We will protect Eleanor's legacy, and yours." Amelia could only nod. The words caught in her throat. After he left, she was truly alone. She walked through the vast, empty rooms of the house she had fought so hard to save. The rage, the cold, clear fury that had been her fuel for weeks, had finally burned out. In its place was not triumph, not joy, not even the satisfaction of justice served. There was only a vast, silent, hollow ache. She had won. The company was hers. The legacy was secure. But the price of that victory was the life she had known. Her husband was a monster. Her newfound sister was a conspirator. Her mother, the woman she finally understood in death, was a tragic figure of immense strength and immense sorrow. Every room was a memory, and every memory was now a lie. She stood in the living room, looking at a framed photograph on the mantel. Herself and Mark on their wedding day, smiling, radiant, oblivious. With a slow, deliberate movement, she picked it up, looked at the face of the man she had loved, and then turned it face down on the polished wood. She had proven beyond any doubt that she was Eleanor Vance's daughter. She was powerful. She was a survivor. She was a queen. But as she stood there, in the dead silence of her reclaimed, empty castle, she understood the final, terrible lesson her mother had taught her. A throne is the loneliest place on earth. In the hollow silence that followed the storm, life settled into a new, sterile rhythm. The names Mark Richards and Clara Jenkins became a stain in the society pages, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties before being replaced by the next scandal. The legal proceedings were a methodical, grinding process, a foregone conclusion, orchestrated by Philip and the full might of his firm. Mark and Clara were ghosts, figures Amelia saw only in the sterile environment of a courtroom, their faces pale and diminished, stripped of the arrogance that had been their armor. Amelia had won. The company was hers, stabilized under her cool, decisive leadership. The house was hers, its rooms now cleansed of the conspirators. But the victory was a cold, barren landscape. The rage that had focused her, the fury that had been her constant companion, had dissipated, leaving behind an echoing void. She was the queen of a silent, lonely kingdom. One rainy evening, seeking a connection to something real, something that hadn't been a lie, she found herself back in her mother's study. She wasn't looking for clues anymore. She simply picked up the dark green journal, the chronicle of her mother's secret heartbreak. She read it again, not as an investigator, but as a daughter trying to understand the weight of the life her mother had been forced to lead. She reached the end, the last page filled with the account of Eleanor's guilt over creating the anonymous trust for Clara. Her fingers traced the final, sorrowful words. She thought that was the end. But as she went to close the book, she noticed the thick leather back cover felt stiff, a slight indentation near the seam. Her curiosity piqued. She worked a fingernail into the edge. The heavy paper lining peeled back, revealing a single, hidden page pasted to the inside of the cover. The handwriting here was different. It was not the youthful script of a heartbroken girl, nor the trembling scrawl of a dying woman. It was the sharp, confident, architectural script of the Eleanor Vance, who had built an empire. There were only 2 sentences. I have known about Mark's infidelity for years. This codicil is not my surrender, it is your final test. Do not disappoint me. Amelia read the lines once, twice, a third time. The air thickened, the world outside the window seemed to recede. A chill, far colder than any she had felt upon discovering the affair, crept down her spine. The elaborate, brilliant gambit she had uncovered was only a fraction of the truth. Her mother had not just been a victim who cleverly fought back in her final days. She had been a long-suffering, silent observer, a grandmaster who had been watching the entire board for years. She had known her son-in-law was a cheater. She had likely suspected the depths of his greed long before Clara ever appeared. The revelation reframed everything. Her mother hadn't just reacted to Mark and Clara's plot. She had used it. She had allowed their conspiracy to unfold, had watched them lay their clumsy traps, seeing in their treachery the perfect, brutal instrument to forge her daughter into the leader she needed to be. The will was not a desperate gambit. It was a calculated, cold-blooded final lesson. Eleanor had not been trying to save Amelia from the fire. She had intentionally let the fire rage, confident that her daughter had the strength to walk through it and emerge reborn, cleansed of all weakness and dependency, including her dependency on a worthless husband. It was the cruelest, most profound act of love Amelia could possibly imagine. She finally understood. Her mother's love was not a soft, comforting blanket. It was a blacksmith's hammer, designed to beat the impurities out of the steel. She hadn't given Amelia what she wanted: a warm, present mother, a perfect family, a life of ease. She had given her what she needed: a brilliant mind, a core of unshakable strength, and one last, terrible trial to activate it all. That is the devastating truth about the legacies we inherit. Sometimes, the people who love us most don't give us what we want, but what we need. They don't build us a shelter from the storm. They teach us how to become the storm itself. And Amelia finally understood the terrifying power behind a lifetime of quiet endurance. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long, because in that silence, they are not breaking. They are planning. She stood up and walked to the great window overlooking the Boston skyline. The city lights a constellation of power at her feet. It was her city now, her empire, her throne. The victory was absolute, but the cost had been her entire world. She was alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She was complete. Amelia Vance had reclaimed her kingdom, but the throne is a lonely place. What becomes of a queen forged in the fires of betrayal? Perhaps that is a story for another night.